I wanted to talk to you all just a little bit about our starting point for the course. In one sense, choosing a date like 1660 seems rather arbitrary. Studying Western civilization is not like studying the history of the United States. There's no clear, climactic division like the American Civil War that allows for easy organization. Yet, at the same time, Europe in 1660 was very clearly a continent in transition. So to help us get a handle on the task that lies before us, let's get a bird's eye view of developments and trends on the ground at this time. First, how do we know what we know about this time? There's not much in the way of official statistics because 17th century governments were often not able to keep good records. Fraud, ineffective bureaucracies, wars, and natural disasters are often to blame for this. Yet while this creates difficulties for historians, there is enough material available for us to piece together a decent snapshot of European society at the time. Governments were not yet developed enough to take reliable censuses, but from what we can tell, the continent's population in the 17th century was somewhere between 70 and 80 million. Disease, famine, and warfare combined to keep the population from growing, leading some historians to describe Europe as being in crisis during the 17th century. The largest and generally perceived as the most powerful kingdom was France, which boasted a population of about 19 or 20 million by 1700. England, a country that would become the globe's preeminent power by the 19th century, had only 5.5 million by mid-century. Most Europeans of the time were rural. Only 5% lived in cities larger than 20,000, and maybe 20% lived in what we would categorize as small towns. This very rural society was also incredibly linguistically diverse, even within these large, powerful kingdoms. For example, even as late as the 1790s, a majority of French people did not speak French. In 1861, the year that the modern Kingdom of Italy emerged, only 3% understood Italian. So, for the first couple of centuries of our class, most governments strived to implement a common tongue. The agrarian society of early modern Europe had the family as the central social and economic structure. Most economic production occurred within the household, agricultural or otherwise. For urban families whose livelihood might be some kind of craft or trade, home was typically above or behind the shop. Manufacturing was typically not done in large factories, but done through what was called the putting out system, in which some entrepreneur would parcel out work to households. Family life patterns in some ways was different than what we might expect. For example, marriage happened later than what we might think, at least in northwestern Europe, where the average age at marriage was in the mid-20s. This late marriage pattern served as a kind of check on fertility. Typical families, again in the northwest of Europe, might have kids every 2 to 2.5 years, and the average woman spent no more than 5 years pregnant. It is possible that nursing also served as a check on fertility. Giving birth in this early modern era was risky, especially by modern standards. Probably 1 to 2% of women died in childbirth, and then the risks were passed on to the child. For example, in 17th century London, 1 in 3 children were dead before their first birthday, and 1 in 7 in the English countryside. Life expectancy at birth in 17th century Europe was typically in the 30s, but once you made it past early childhood, your odds of living longer increased. Historians used to believe that high infant and child mortality weakened the parent-child bond at this time, but the evidence does not seem to support that thesis. Parents then were very much like parents today, spoiling their children, reading the latest manuals on rearing children, mourning their deaths, which of course was all too common. Speaking of mortality, life in general, for rich and poor alike, was difficult by modern standards. Fire, warfare, famine, and disease were all too common. Smallpox, typhoid, and the plague were consistent problems for urban Europeans. Medical care was poor, because knowledge was fairly limited and fresh water was scarce, which of course was a major culprit in the spread of disease. The mass of European population in 1660 was generally disconnected from the larger questions of politics and war. It's safe to say that the chasm between the elites and everyone else was very large, though it's not to say that their decisions did not affect those below. And during the 17th and 18th centuries, central governments across Europe endeavored to increase the power and influence of the state as well as its role in the lives of their subjects. As we will see in Unit 1, this was generally with the goal of enabling one's subjects to flourish within what monarchs believed was their proper role in society. Nevertheless, it was clear by the end of the 17th century that older, more medieval forms of government which emphasized local power were being replaced by something new called absolutism.